Hello, everyone. My name is Miranda, and I am your Enchantress of Avalon, and welcome back to my channel. I have decided that I will be posting new videos every Sunday, so I hope that you will subscribe and join me here for a little bit of time in Avalon each Sunday. I am your guide into the realms of the mystical, your guide into Avalon. So, for today's entry in this series, if you will, about Avalonian history, I am going to be talking about the most important figure of Avalon. She is also my favorite figure of all of the Arthurian legends. Now, you'll hear me talk about her a lot, and she is Morgan le Fay. Now, she's known by many names. She is known as Morgane, Morgan, Morgana, and then sometimes with Le Fay, sometimes with other mixtures of the names. So today I want to specifically talk about her origins. So Morgan le Fay is most often described as the sister of King Arthur in the legends. While this is true, she was his sister in about 90% of the tellings you're going to find. She'll be his sister. She's always connected to him, connected to Camelot, connected to the Arthurian legends, but her most important association is Avalon, which is where this channel gets its name, where I took my title of Enchantress of Avalon from, where my blog's name of White Rose of Avalon comes from. It's from this mystical holy island of Avalon. It is the Isle of Apples, sometimes called the Isle of Glass, the Isle of Crystal, the Isle of the Blessed. It has very many names. And since I want to talk about Morgan's origins, I am going to start with the most obvious place. I'm going to start with the beginning. Her first literary reference, which was in Geoffrey of Monmouth's work, the Vita Merlini. Geoffrey of Monmouth was a cleric and a historian writing in the very, very beginning of the Middle Ages. He had already gained great literary success by writing his History of the Regem Britanniae, which is Latin, and it means History of the Kings of Britain. And that work is where he firmly established his love of the Arthurian tales. He talks about the reigns of both Uther and Arthur, Pendragon. He gave them the name Pendragon, in fact. I don't believe that the surname Pendragon was attached before that point. If I am wrong, please someone tell me so in the comments. I'm always happy to learn something new. And it establishes a lot about Arthur's origin stories, and it features, of course, the great mage Merlin. Merlin was a figure that was of great interest to Geoffrey of Monmouth, so much so that he decided he was going to write an entire new book, a poem about Merlin, about his life, and that's where we get the Vita Merlini. It translates to the life of Merlin. And the Vita Merlini is our first ever literary reference, our first ever meeting of Morgan. We meet her in that prose well, it's a poem, but we meet her in this poem as Morgan, spelt Morgen. Now, I already said she goes by a lot of different names. This is how Monmouth spelled her name. And it does become important because a lot of modern day Avalonian witchcraft practitioners who view themselves as high priestesses, who become high priestesses, take on the mantle of Morgan, and they spell it in that same way. So this Morgan, we only actually see her in one paragraph at the very end of the poem, but it is such a powerful paragraph, and we get so much information about this island nation that she lives on, which we know today as Avalon. Monmouth didn't actually call it Avalon. I believe he calls it the Fortunate Isle in his text, but it is, again, Avalon, obviously, including mentions of apples. And he describes how this place works, and he describes Morgan. He describes her as the most beautiful, the most talented, and the leader amongst a sisterhood of 9. So she has 8 other sisters who are also queens of Avalon, who are also working with her in this beautiful, magical place. And she has and Arthur has been brought to her in order to be healed. So she's known as a great healer, a great magical worker, a great fairy woman. And even Monmouth's description of her makes you think she was a goddess. And if we go back to the earliest tradition, she probably was. We have every reason to suspect that she, like Rhiannon, was a goddess who was demoted to merely being described as a fairy woman later. And then Morgan devolved further to be the evil sorceress of our great Arthurian legends. So I will get to that point, but we're just at the very beginning. Monmouth in this paragraph also describes the island and how magical it is. In this island where Morgan and her sisters rule and they heal people, we are told that humans can live for 100 years or more on this island because it is so powerful and so cleansing and so healing. We are told that everything grows and renews itself without the need to cultivate it, meaning that the apple trees, because the apple orchard is talked about in Vita Merlini, and the grapes that they harvest for wine, they don't need to cultivate. They don't need to be working the fields all day long to get all of these amazing gifts of the land. They just grow of their own volition. And it's an incredibly beautiful thing. So we get that description. Of Morgan herself, though, we learn, like I said, she's the most beautiful of the 9 sisters, as well as the leader and the most powerful. This was a time in all through the medieval period and even into the Renaissance period, there was this belief that someone's outward visage, their outward appearance, denoted how they were in their inner soul. So if someone was beautiful, they were innately good. And if someone was ugly, and especially if someone was deformed in some way, they were innately evil. This goes back actually to earlier traditions, and I'm going to mention specifically the Celtic because that's where the Arthurian legends are rooted, in the Celtic, heavily rooted in the Celtic people. I cannot stress that enough. Well, in Celtic tradition, a king had to be pristine. He had to be perfectly formed. So if a king was somehow damaged in battle, if he lost something, if he lost a limb, if he became horribly scarred, if he became deaf or blind in some way from an injury, he could no longer be king, because there was this desire to have a physically perfect monarch, because this was the perfection of the land. He was the land made manifest, so you needed him to be fittingly perfect in a physical sense. So that's where we get this tradition, and that's where we can see that Morgan in the earliest tradition was a totally benevolent magical woman. She was a healer. She was probably a goddess. She was certainly a fairy woman, and she was this incredible figure. She was so inspirational, and that's why I think modern Avalonian high priestesses are so blessed and so happy to take on the title of Morgan, spelled with a G-E-N. And we also get the first reference of, besides her being a healer, of her being a shapeshifter, which is something that carries through all of the legends, her ability to change her appearance at will. In this case, he describes her as being able to fly on strange wings like Daedalus. Essentially, he's describing, that's an exact quote, by the way, but essentially in this, he's describing her as being able to fly and able to transfigure herself into a bird, which is, incidentally, slight tangent, where in the Harry Potter universe, she is described as having been an actual figure, and she's on the Chocolate Frog cards, evil sorceress, all that good stuff. But specifically, she's also considered to be one of the first animaguses because she could transform herself into a crow. That actually goes back to the very earliest traditions, as I just mentioned. She could transfigure into a crow or a raven. So that's pretty badass, pretty awesome. She was very magically gifted, and she was in this poem saying that if she could have Arthur with her in Avalon for long enough, she could heal him of his wounds, and he could wait there until he was called forth to need when his country needed him the most again. Which takes us to the amazing Avalonian, or rather the amazing Arthurian tradition of the once and future king. This is where it started. You've probably heard this before. Arthur was the greatest king England ever knew, and he will come again when his country needs him most. That is where it started. In the Vita Merlini, which is unfortunately often a quite forgotten text, except for people like me who are obsessed with Morgana le Fay and need to read everything they can about her, or obsessed with Merlin and need to read everything they can about him. But I highly recommend reading it. You could get copies of it online for $20-$30. You could also search your local libraries, but I definitely suggest reading it. It is a quite short read because it's a poem. If you get a good translation, it'll be worth it. So, okay. Moving on to the next version of Morgana le Fay. That is the Chrétien de Troyes version of Morgana, and he writes about her in his Arthurian romances. A little backstory about Chrétien de Troyes. He was a poet who was living at the court of Marie of France, not to be confused with the poetess Marie de France. Marie of France was the Duchess of Champagne. She was the daughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine and her first husband, Louis VII. And much like her mother, as Marie took very much so after Eleanor, she decided that she was going to have this beautiful court of love and this place where it would be an artistic enclave. She was a big supporter of writers, of artists, of poets, of all sorts. And two of the most famous writers of the period lived at her court. There was Chrétien de Troyes, and there was also Andreas Capellanus. I do not know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but he wrote The Art of Courtly Love, which is, the Courtly Love Manifesto. It tells you exactly what it is. It tells you exactly how to live by the tenets of the courtly love tradition, which so ties in with Arthurian legends and which so ties in with royal history, so two of my obsessions. It's a very important book, and I got my copy on Goodreads for a few bucks, my copy on Thrift Books for a few dollars. It's well worth it to go and search it out and find a copy. I love my copy. And anyway, so Chrétien de Troyes, though, was specifically writing Arthurian romances, and he is credited with, two things that he did that were really important to the Arthurian canon. One doesn't apply so much to today's talk, but I do want to mention it, and that